here in the wilderness. There's mystery everywhere you look. Come on, Twig. Let's get my sketchbook. Done.
This concept of white privilege is meant to attack white identity, attack white people, and incite violence against us, and that is what you all have been incited by. You are products of a system of indoctrination that has led to the marginalization and attacks on white people.
Time to go.
The other day, a friend of mine saw fit to subject me to a viewing of the cartoon Hilda, and I thought it was okay. The show is colorful and cute with an overall chilled and cozy atmosphere, and the subject matter is interesting enough to keep older viewers entertained while tame enough as to refrain from frightening young children. It's based on a graphic novel by Luke Pearson, who seems to pretty much embody the spirit of the program as I've just described it to you. Chill and cozy.
I don't think Hilda really has anything in common with me. Like, I actually think she's kind of what I would have liked to have been like as a child, but I really wasn't. I was always very, well, still am, you know, like I'm inward and unadventurous and cowardly, and I tried to write her as the opposite of me.
At just 3 episodes in, I'm adequately engaged with the series and its characters to the point where I wouldn't mind seeing more in the future, and I might even have to look into picking up the books sometime. But as of now, I don't have a very strong opinion on Hilda. So why am I talking about it? Well, upon searching up the series myself after my first watch, I happened to stumble across an article with a rather peculiar title attached to it, and I felt like it was important to share and give my thoughts on the matters presented therein. Can Hilda liberate European fantasy from white supremacists is probably the strangest question I've heard posed to me in recent memory. Written by Miles Marcus, the article low-key puts the show on blast for several creative decisions and heavily implies that Hilda is walking a quote-unquote knife's edge by delving into Scandinavian mythology, suggesting that the mere presence of European fantasy elements in fiction is enough to condone genocide. That sounds pretty bad. So let's dig deeper. Miles begins the piece by offering a brief synopsis of the show and giving his 2 cents on its quality before diving headlong into discussing literal white supremacy and its apparent involvement in European fantasy. He draws a connection between Norse mythos and Nazism, citing that the Nazis would invoke the myth and attempted to institute a form of neo-paganism, both subjects which I am admittedly unfamiliar with. I'll take his word for it. Having established that there is some sort of inexorable link between fantasy and fascism, Miles goes on to claim that this in turn has caused, quote, an outsized influence and presence of fascists in the subculture of fantasy literature. While he provides neither evidence nor explanation for this claim, I'm going to operate under the assumption that he didn't just make it up, and that this isn't just him projecting his own personal experiences with the community onto the genre and culture as a whole. It would be rather silly of him to have written a nearly 4,000-word post on a totally unfounded claim. After dismissing both fascism and white nationalism as a parody of intellectualism and white supremacy respectively, I find myself beginning to wonder just what any of this has to do with a British-Canadian children's cartoon. Miles goes off on a tangent discussing a YouTuber known as the Golden One, and instead of presenting and dismantling his ideas for himself, he directs his readers to a video by H Bomber Guy, who is, in Miles' own words, a more palatable YouTuber. Having viewed H Bomber Guy's defense of Dark Souls 2, I can't say that I agree with that sentiment on its face. Skipping the petty portions of the article, we finally find ourselves at the heart of this great beast, and this is where everything starts to go downhill. Drawing upon racial interpretations of Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, Miles delivers the thesis of his essay, that creators of European-inflected fantasy are creating work which is engaging with the ideas of white supremacy. Let me break down exactly what the problem with this statement is. By utilizing certain people's subjective interpretations of the fantastical races present in The Lord of the Rings, Miles has asserted that there is an issue inherent to the fantasy genre itself, specifically European fantasy, and that issue is that white supremacist ideologies are inextricably bound to the genre and as a result will always arise from its themes, consequently engaging with these ideas and therefore validating them. This is false, plainly because these interpretations are subjective, meaning that nowhere in the text itself is it stated that dwarves or orcs are allegorical to real-life races. These ideas are only prevalent because we as readers have crafted them from our own personal experiences with the medium. In fact, if one wanted to be technical about all of this, it could probably be argued that the various creatures found in The Lord of the Rings are more akin to different species rather than different races, and thus the entire racial element is fabricated due to this fact alone. This statement also disregards fantasy novels that take a subversive approach to these creatures. Stan Nichols' Orcs trilogy comes to mind, but that's neither here nor there. The important thing to note here is that one cannot control what a reader or viewer will get out of consuming media. If someone interprets a meaning in a story that you don't like, that's too bad, because you can't stop them. But it doesn't make them right either. I could easily make up an interpretation for how the plot of Star Wars is a brilliantly concealed metaphor for making the perfect sandwich. I could do this for plenty of stories, but simply because I can personally find this theme present in every story I read does not mean that every story I read has that theme rooted inside of it by design. Miles ignores the fact that it's totally possible for somebody to find meaning in something that was never intended to have such a meaning in the first place. That's how subjectivity works. We ascribe meanings to art based on how we personally perceive them. The artist has no control over what those meanings turn out to be or who they come from. And it is certainly not an artist's job to dissuade people of certain ideologies, explicitly or otherwise, to keep them from consuming their artwork. Did I forget to mention that? Yeah. He said that. The implication being that if you have not performed the task of keeping undesirables from reading your books or watching your movies to Miles' specific standards, you have somehow failed as an artist and should be ashamed. But I think it's clear that there's only one author who should be feeling ashamed right now. If crazy people think that certain films or novels somehow validate their own twisted worldviews, the solution is not to stop creating these films or novels entirely. You can't stop crazy people from reading crazy into your work. The sandwich people exist. They will read your books and watch your movies. You cannot stop them. To suggest that you can is not only vain, but ridiculous. So what does any of this have to do with Hilda? Good question, Miles. I was about to ask you the same thing. His answer: as a fantasy story with a Scandinavian-inspired setting, it is playing in dangerous territory. More insidiously, something like Hilda could be a building block in the white supremacist fantasy landscape of a future generation's Marcus Fallen or Stormfront messenger board. This insinuation is heinous and cruel by itself, but Miles isn't done. After a brief defensive praising of the show's ethnically diverse cast, citing instances of browns, blacks, and hijabs, as well as applauding the way in which it represents its creatures as misunderstood rather than inherently vile, he goes on to claim that by virtue of the fact that Hilda is white, this buys into what he would call the fascist, white supremacist worldview. The character Hilda possesses what Miles describes as a special connection to the unseen world, and therefore concludes that, quote, this positions Hilda's whiteness as a sign of her ability to engage with and control the supernatural, and Frida's blackness as a sign of her disconnection from those forces. He defends himself by admitting that the decision to portray the magical elements of the show in this way may not have been for racial reasons, but that its effect on the meaning remains regardless. To paraphrase his final paragraph, Hilda walks on a knife's edge, running the grave risk of encouraging or emboldening genocidal ideologies, should it be cut. There is a lot that I could say regarding Miles' blatant and borderline malicious attack on Hilda. One angle I could take is that in regarding the series creator Luke Pearson's creative choice to portray his protagonist as Caucasian as an endorsement of white supremacy and fascism, that accusing him of such is a deplorable action at best. Pearson is clearly passionate about his work, and he appears to care deeply for the characters he has created. To suggest that he crafted them with racist intentions is reaching into what could be considered legally slanderous territory. I could also take the approach that Miles is, in fact, the real racist in the room, and not Luke. Think about it. A primary character is portrayed as being more supernaturally adept than her secondary counterpart, and Miles immediately comes to the conclusion that the power lies with Hilda because she is white, and that Frida lacks the power because she is black. While he himself admitted that this probably isn't what Luke Pearson had in mind, it's still where his brain went to when presented with these two characters, and I think that says a lot more about Miles than it does about Luke. But I think that the third and final angle is the one that I find most befitting of a man such as Miles Marcus, that he is simply a stupid man who doesn't understand subjectivity in art. Yes, I'm calling you stupid, Miles. Be glad that I'm not calling you worse, because as stated previously, I certainly have the grounds to. Let me explain. As I said before, to find meaning in a work of art is a subjective and consequentially personal process, wherein more often than not you will come to such conclusions on your own terms and based on your own thoughts and experiences. If I saw Luke Skywalker as a slice of bread struggling to reunite with his father, also a slice of bread, this was a personal interpretation I found in the film on my own. There is no inherent implication that all science fantasy stories are about making sandwiches, present simply because that's what I believe that the story was about. To give a more grounded example, I personally personally found meaning in the slice of life comedy series Ah Channel. The meaning to me was about dealing with depression, and I could cite several instances in the show that I believe help to substantiate this idea. However, this is irrelevant because the anime never explicitly portrays itself as a story about depression. I found that meaning. The creators didn't give it to me, as Miles would have you believe. I found Orcs to be a story which muses about the merits of ethno-nationalism, but just because I personally saw these messages does not mean that the author of Orcs should be taken to task for his work of fiction. Miles Marcus is so dense, so agonizingly dumb, that he genuinely believes that because some white supremacists found a way to rationalize their racism through Tolkien, that all European fantasy must be drenched in ethnically diverse bleach, that white characters like Hilda should be shunned as fascist propaganda, and that anyone dabbling in the genre is condoning genocide unless it is explicitly stated otherwise. Hilda is a lovely show. At worst, it's a stylistically gimmicky cash-in on the Gravity Falls crowd that's pretty to look at, and at best, it's a wonderful tale about making friends, understanding those who are different from you, and participating in a beautiful fantasy world involving trolls, elves, and giants. Its characters are perfectly voiced, and its colors are soothing to the eye. There's enough substance for those who look for it, and enough humor for those who just want to laugh. Luke Pearson has crafted what is, in my estimation, a fine story, a fine world, and even finer characters. And speaking as someone who has only watched 3 episodes of your show, I want to say that you have a clear talent for the medium, and I am sorry that you have to deal with idiots like Miles Marcus. Whimsical is the word that comes to mind when I think of what best describes a show like Hilda. The term white supremacy doesn't even cross it.
You got the will of a wild bird. You got the faith of a child before the world gets in.